episode 7 of the Data Driven Strength podcast. I'm here with Zach as well as Jake, and most importantly, Zach's dog Maya, who you might hear in the background, but we're glad to have her. Today, we're just going to kind of sit down and chat about a single topic, as opposed to a lot of the Q&As we've done in the past. We often talk about proximity to failure, and I know that's a research interest for all of us. There might be different routes of how we kind of examine proximity to failure in general, but it's an interest of all of ours. So we kind of wanted to sit down and just discuss pretty casually, some of the practical implications of how we're actually defining failure, and some of the practical implications of this. And again, hopefully we'll give you some practical takeaways so this can be of use to you. So again, we often discuss proximity to failure, and perhaps a fault of our own is we try to discuss the limitations of proximity to failure and quantifying it, but we might not do that enough. So to start off, I'm going to pass over to Zach, and he's just going to quickly discuss some of the general limitations of proximity to failure and quantifying it.
Yeah, I think that's kind of a really good intro into kind of discussing what we're talking about. We talk about proximity to failure a ton and make a lot of recommendations about that topic specifically, but as Josh said, the limitations themselves are bountiful, and I don't think we often give that the at-length discussion it really deserves. So this kind of topic we were just throwing around and just talking about the limitations of failure. What does that mean? How is that defined in the research? And then how does that actually ultimately impact our recommendations on how people should train in the gym? So I think, just the overarching kind of definition of what we probably would most closely align failure as is, I would tend to think this is what most people in the gym would consider it as well. And it is simply this. Muscle failure is when you're trying to, with maximal effort, trying to complete a repetition, and despite that effort, you're no longer able to do so. And generally, that's going to be on the concentric portion of the movement. That's kind of what we're referring to as failure. Now, when we shift over to the research, that is going to be a lot more heterogeneous in nature in terms of the methods and the way that they're going to classify failure. So I'm going to kick it over to Jake there. That was just kind of a general outline to get us started here. And he's our kind of resident RIR accuracy expert, so he can kind of talk about the different ways that failure is defined in the research, maybe how that compares to how we do it in practice, and kind of kick off a discussion here.
Yeah, so the some of the common ways that we'll see it in the research is they'll call it something like volitional interruption or volitional failure, which is essentially stopping you don't think you can do another repetition. But we also know from some of the research that's directly looking at accuracy of RIR ratings or RPE ratings, that even when people think they have 0 repetitions left, they still a lot of times have 1 or 2. So there's some issues with that. Sometimes they'll describe that they went to failure, but in the method section of the study, they don't describe it very in depth. So it's a little bit ambiguous there. Sometimes the researchers will very strongly encourage the subjects as they're lifting to really get more repetitions, whereas other times they don't even mention that in the study. So there's a lot of things to look for in there. So like the way that can translate to practice is kind of iffy, because in practice a lot of times maybe you have gym partners or other people around you that are pushing you. Maybe when you go to failure, you make sure you fail in the middle of a rep versus stopping when you think you're going to fail the next rep, that kind of thing. So a lot of differences.
Yeah, that was a really good overview, Jake. I think, it leads to, I think the practical conclusion of this is we have to have humility when interpreting and communicating the proximity to failure research, because of how easy it is to have different definitions of failure, right? And not to fault the researchers by any means, but it's just important to realize that person A's failure might not be person B's failure. So for that reason, and especially considering that investigating proximity to failure as a training variable is kind of a new thing in general in the research, I think it opens the door to 2 possibilities in addition to kind of some of the conclusions we've already came to. On one hand, maybe no research groups have actually gotten to quote unquote true failure, and maybe there is something actually magical at the end of the set that happens. I don't think that's the case. I don't think Zach or Jake thinks that's the case, but that's a possibility, right? That's still on the table. On the other hand, there's also the possibility that in the research, with the encouragement of research assistants, a good training environment, that these subjects are actually training really, like, truly to failure, whereas a lot of people don't do that in the gym, right? Just the differences in environment can influence that. That on the other hand, maybe we can train more like 8 to 12 RIR and see really good results. So again, I don't think that either ends of that spectrum are correct. That's not my conjecture at all. But those possibilities are still on the table because it is hard to actually objectively define failure, and because this is a relatively early body of literature.
Yeah, I don't have too much to add to that. Just to echo it and agree. I think we talk about proximity to failure a ton. Obviously, the low fatigue stuff has kind of, people know us for that, and it's kind of become a meme at this point. But I think Josh's point is really well taken. The reality is this stuff is new, and the methods are extremely, extremely different across the studies that we look at. So it's really hard to make comparison and have a high degree of confidence when communicating the results of those studies. So I think it's just something we need to keep in the back of our head. Two things that, as Josh said, these results could be biased in the way that we're actually investigating these questions, and the methods could be slightly different than what the questions we're actually trying to ask. As I kind of said to begin with, the definition I think most people use in the gym is trying to complete a repetition with maximal effort, but despite that effort, you're not able to complete another repetition. I think that's pretty unanimously what people are talking about. But if that's not what we're actually looking at in the research, which again, we're not faulting the researchers, it's just it's a difference in definition and a difference in the way that they're actually examining the question. And there's also logistical considerations on the researchers' part that I think sometimes people don't give them enough credit. Like, it's very difficult to construct a study that may be ethical to tell someone to do something against their intentions. If a subject doesn't feel safe going to failure, it's going to be difficult to get them to do so, and all those kind of considerations. But the point being that it's going to be difficult to have really concrete recommendations due to these limitations. And we should have humility when doing so, as Josh said. And the reality is, at the end of the day, anyway, there's going to be a ton of individual variability in how people respond to the recommendations we make. So regardless, having concrete, set in stone, black and white recommendations probably doesn't make a ton of sense. So I think that's a reminder to us as communicators of this information, but also to all the listeners out there that if anyone is telling you a black and white recommendations of your RIR for a specific goal, I would likely be a little bit skeptical.
Yeah, I made a post on that. It was like, why we don't make RIR or RPE recommendations. And it's tough, right? Because at the end of the day, not everybody wants like the nitty gritty nuance. They just want to train. So I do understand if you are giving general guidelines, like that's necessary to some degree.
100%.
So, but I don't think we're at a point where we're super comfortable with that. Obviously the rubber has to hit the road. We have to put RPs on the paper. So there's definitely,
I think just to add one more layer on top of that, and I think we've had this discussion a ton off the air. This is where I would put my anecdote hat on. And I think, in general, if I'm unclear in a direction of the RIR kind of equation, most likely I'm going to bias it in the closer to failure direction, simply because we have so many, and this is primarily speaking of hypertrophy, we have so many bodybuilders that have trained to failure and swore that's how you have to train to get big, and that's probably something we shouldn't ignore. That doesn't mean that it's going to be 100% infallible, but I'm saying if there's a degree of uncertainty, we have to, this is not a good example. We have to pick between making the bottom end of the cutoff RP7 or RP5 in general, if there's equivocal evidence to support that, I'm probably going to go with the higher number, just because that seems to fit in line with most people's anecdote that have done this for a long time. And that's something we probably can't turn a blind eye to, in my opinion. Yeah. So,
and failure is kind of foolproof.
Yeah.
Right. And like, no matter how you configure your training variables, if you take the steps failure, you're going to see pretty good results. Whereas if we are kind of biasing things farther from failure, you're going to want to make sure that certain other variables are in place to do that effectively. So I think that's important to point out, is when in doubt, you should probably go a bit closer to failure. It's a bit more foolproof.
Mm-hmm. I agree. I think, you can even think about that, like using your example, 5 RPE versus 7 RPE. Erring on the side of the 7 means that most people are actually going to stop at like 5,
mm-hmm.
right? So like, I think that's probably safer than if you tell someone to stop at 5, they're going to actually stop at like 2.
Yeah.
Right. So
that kind of leads me to the next thing I want to chat about is like, have either of you guys taken like a set of, we should probably focus this around lower body training, because I think this applies a bit more, like a back squat set to true failure, where you try the next repetition, but you actually cannot lift it. Not like you rack it because you didn't think you could do another rep, but actually you completed the rep, so you have to try another and you fail.
Yeah, I had a period of time in high school when I was an idiot, but it was probably the most brutal training I've ever done. I still think this was one thing I was going to bring up, and I've made a post on this before. Like I almost view like that as like a really valuable experience of novice training, though. Like I almost like it, I haven't sat down and formally thought about this, so if it sounds stupid or I make an error, don't judge me. But I almost view like novice training, like the first stage of it obviously is to establish behavior change, consistent habits, all that good stuff. But from a program perspective, I view the first half of like getting you prepared to go through this phase of like actually taking a few sets to failure. I think that would be a really, really valuable kind of thing to get you to. Now we know as a novice, you don't need to do that to make good progress. But my point being, I think while that was probably arguably the least productive training in terms of adaptation of my training career, I think mentally and understanding what that feels like. Now I'm definitely out of touch with that. I haven't been that #primal in a long time, but I do think in the back of my mind, I know at the end of the day what failure feels like, and that definitely helps me gauge the proximity to failure of the rest of my work and understand that there's always another gear I can go if I deem that necessary from a program perspective, and just referencing that to the rest of my work. So yes, I have done that. They were probably the most ugly 185-pound squats you've ever seen in your entire life, and the pins were probably way too high, but yeah, I have done that.
How about you, Jake?
I've not done that with squats or like big I'd save that stuff for like hack squats or leg press or something where I feel more safe. Yeah. But that's funny that you mentioned that.
Squats are more effective, dude. You have to grind to all the stuff.
Why do you think my arms are so big? Like squats. But like I always think about that too with people who just chronically undershoot everything. It's like you never had a bro phase. Mm-hmm. Like they didn't do what we're talking about, where you just do stupid stuff that you're not making your best progress. Right. But it does teach you how to train hard. That is valuable.
Yeah, I did that. No, I'm actually remembering now a little bit. I did the 5-3-1 too. I ran 5-3-1 for a little bit with the plus set on the final week, and I did that on all the exercises as well. That was a valuable. I think that was a valuable experience too, because that was like the first time I had structured programming that like kind of led it up into those, and so it wasn't just like me just trashing myself every week. It was somewhat intelligent. Yeah. So that I think that helped too. Again, it was just another way that I could gauge and understand the rest of my training at that point was so submaximal that it just helped me. Yeah, it's just 5-3-1 is constructed very interestingly.
And I think it's so while we all agree that it's important to take a set to true failure to experience what that is, so we can kind of anchor going forward. I think it's also important to kind of discuss some of the practical execution of this. So the first thing I want to kind of chat about is what's called repetition cadence. And shout out to Steve DeNovi, who actually a discussion Steve and I had kind of was the spark for this podcast that kind of gave me the idea of, hey, let's sit down and just chat about this. He asked me, like, in the research, is repetition cadence controlled for? So if we use the example of a back squat, at the top of each repetition, Do you go straight into the next one? Do you take a few breaths? How does that work? Because I think a lot of us have experienced that, maybe you put your 10 RM on the bar, you do 8 reps, you take 4 or 5 breaths at the top, you can bang out 5 more reps, right? So you're kind of artificially extending the set. So I guess what I kind of want to, and I'll pass this over to you, Jake, in a second, because I think you're best suited to answer this. Obviously, at the top of rep number 8, you can't go directly into the next rep, right? There needs to be some pause between repetitions, whether you need to take 1 breath or whatever. But obviously, you don't want to turn it into a rest pause type set. So, do you have any general thoughts on that, or any practical recommendations of, okay, I'm going to do an RIR audit in which I'm going to take a set to true failure to kind of help me anchor this? How should you best go about that? Because while avoiding artificially extending a set.
I think that the main thing is just to try to keep it standard every time. So like if you're going to do, say you're aiming to you think you're going to get 10 reps or whatever, right? So maybe you do this multiple weeks in a row. So then I'm going to take, at the top of every rep, I'll blow my air out, take a new breath in and squat. And then maybe after rep 8, you take 3 breaths. Like just keeping it standard every time you do it, I think just minimizes the variance as much as possible. I will say if you're trying to do an audit on like squats, for example, just make sure you get spotters because that can get a little gnarly.
Or save the audit for something else.
Yeah, I generally save that for like machine work or something without that skill component. But I think I think that takes care of almost everything. If you just keep it pretty standard, it just simplifies so much.
Yeah, and I think once you keep it standard, well, when you're standardizing things, you obviously want it within a reasonable range, right? Sure. You don't want to be resting 10 seconds at the top of some reps. And you also don't want to be going like some sort of constant tension thing, although there might be a time and a place to program something like that. Basically what I'm saying is there's a reasonable middle ground, but once you're in that reasonable middle ground, I wouldn't overthink where you are. Just try to keep it standard, because once you have it standardized, you can adjust the dose from there and properly assess the response. So another example of this is warm-ups. Some people warm up to a top set a lot differently than other people. And while there might be slightly better or worse ways to warm up, in general, I don't think it's a huge deal as long as you find it works for yourself. But the biggest thing is keeping it standard, because that warm-up training is training volume. And I think, again, keeping it standard week to week so you're not seeing these peaks and valleys in training volume, although it's not necessarily overtly calculated in the spreadsheet or whatever, just keeping it standard week to week, keeping your RP8 standard week to week, that kind of thing is important, because then once the coach goes in, or maybe you're coaching yourself and you adjust the dose, you know that there aren't these massive confounding factors. So again, I would just echo Jake and say that standardization is huge. So I don't know if you have anything to add, Zach.
No, the only thing I really thought of was just like keeping what you're calling like your self-reported RPE consistent from like a qualitative perspective of what the lift you're rating is because of like I'm thinking to myself, like calling a single at 8 for like 6 weeks in a row, and like on week 7 after like a progression I fail, and that clearly shows that my RPs were inaccurate. So like that just that can lead to a lot of headaches. So just understanding like, and that's common sense, like RP8 should be 2 repetitions in reserve. Like that's not a mind-blowing comment, but I just think that it can really impact progression. Just a ton of things in the gym if you don't really take a step back and really try to keep that consistent. But yeah, I largely would agree. I think all the noise of the variability and all the things that can impact an individual set's RPE rating or RER accuracy can generally be mitigated by just keeping the way that you're doing things consistent. So keeping your definition of failure consistent, whether that be technical failure or actual muscle failure, which we can talk about here next. Also keeping the breath component, as we mentioned, consistent, or repetition cadence consistent. Rest periods, I think, can also play into that too. That can make, the set feel maybe a little bit harder than the actual objective performance potentially. That kind of stuff. I think as long as you keep that stuff consistent, I think you can mitigate a ton of this. But from a recommendation and from that kind of perspective, I think because it's just another reason we need to be in the back of our minds, understand that there is so much variability in how these methods are carried out that we should have that humility that we talked about a couple times. I'm just going to really hammer that home because I think that's really, really important, because we talk about that a ton, but I also think that's just out there, for the masses a ton. And that, again, that's not to say that guidelines and recommendations aren't useful. It's just to understand that the information this stuff is coming from is pretty, it spreads a wide gap, and there's a ton of different ways that the methods are carried out. So just have humility and have some degree of just scale your confidence to the evidence available, which is admittedly not perfect. So but with that kind of that ramble aside, I think we can kick it over to Jake to kind of, I hinted at there, kind of the technical deviation and how that can play into what we're defining as failure, and maybe some different situations you would consider maybe the movement more holistically versus like kind of the muscle that we're trying to train, that kind of thing. I know we've talked about this. I made a post about this a while ago, kind of muscle versus movement RAR, but go ahead, Jake, kick that off.
Yeah, I think that from those conversations and your posts and everything, the biggest and easiest way to sum it up is just based on the goal. What are we looking at, right? So if we're focused on strength, we probably are more focused on the movement itself, where we allow a little bit more variability within the technique, a little bit more, maybe if we're continuing the squat example, maybe if you're trying to keep the exact same perfect upright knees forward technique on your high bar squat, and you get closer and closer to failure, and all of a sudden your knees start to come back a little bit out of the hole, your butt shoots up a little bit, whatever, as long as it's not excessive and dangerous, right, then like it's fine for the most part, right? As long as if we're prioritizing movement, strength, that kind of thing. If we're prioritizing hypertrophy, I think in that sense it makes a little bit more sense, say that twice in a row, to prioritize like the muscle itself and really looking at technical failure or muscle failure, however you want to, if you want to define technique as like this very, very specific no breakdown or minimal breakdown, I should say, type of thing. So that's kind of, I think, the easiest way to separate it. And then like, again, with that squat example, if you're doing your high bar squats and you start to feel that technique get a little funky, that's where you call it, right? Like that's your anchor for quote unquote failure in that case. Josh, what do you think?
No, I think that's well said. I would just echo kind of the point that keep the goal of each set the goal. So I think sometimes we might find ourselves in an awkward middle ground in which, kind of what comes to mind are sets of 2 to 4 at RP 8 to 10. Like it's not really good strength practice. Now, that's not to say that, a top double at 8 isn't good strength practice, but it's not great hypertrophy training. And it might be excessively fatiguing. So all that's to say is, you kind of have these more strength focused sets or these more hypertrophy focused sets. And for the strength focused sets, you're exposing yourself to that deviation in technique that is inherent to moving heavy loads. And all of us here are not, like, we kind of subscribe to the idea that if you expose yourself to these technical deviations, they're not inherently dangerous, or there's not necessarily going to be an issue there as long as you're exposing yourself to them. So it's important to not only expose yourself to them for that reason, but also to practice it. But then once we do that, we can kind of move on to more muscle-centric training, right? So like Zach said, movement compared to muscle. We move on to that muscle-centric training, and we're not necessarily hanging out in that middle ground, like I mentioned, those awkward sets of, those awkward protocols, like 5 sets of 3 at RP 9. And then when you move on to those more muscle-centric sets, you're kind of finding that balance of, you're not being a technical perfectionist in what you call 0 RIR when your knees just go back 1 centimeter out of the hole when you're trying to target your quads. But, you're keeping it reasonable, and you're like, okay, now I'm getting to the point where my hips are shooting first out of the hole. I'm trying my best to stay in my quads, right? I'm actively fighting it, but I'm no longer able to. So I know this is a good indication I'm nearing the end of the set. So I think differentiated between movement and muscles is probably the biggest thing in how you anchor your RIR based on the goal of that set.
Yeah, I largely agree. I think my kind of thing with that kind of stuff is like, it's kind of like defining a pile of sand versus a grain. Like, you don't really have an exact definition for it, but you kind of know when you see it.
Yeah.
In terms of technical deviation of what's acceptable and what's not. As Josh said, don't be a perfectionist about it to an excessive degree, because that can limit how hard you're training. And that's definitely not something we want to do. But having some degree of constraints that you're putting on yourself to make sure that each set is pretty high quality is important as well. But yeah, that's pretty much all I have to add to that.
When you kind of mentioned how, you can't really quantify a lot of these things, that reminds me, I recently chatted to a physical therapist about some pec issues I've been having, and he was giving me some suggestions about rehab protocols, and he was describing like how hard to take them. Like, he's like, this isn't really training volume, but it's not like you're just going through the motions. And he was just like, I could see the wheels turning, and I knew exactly what he meant, but there's no way to actually quantify it.
Yeah.
So I think it kind of, that applies here as well, right? There's like, I'm not looking at your knees out of the hole, and
6 centimeters is when the set is failure.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it's also not like I'm telling my clients, hey, after rep 7, you're taking 3 breaths and then going.
Yeah.
Like, it's not that nuanced. It's just kind of keeping things in this appropriate ballpark, I think is probably the best for
80-20 principle, 80% consistent, 20% deviation.
Exactly. Yeah. Well said. Anything to add, Jake?
Not really. That was very well said.
I think the last thing I want to touch on before we wrap up, unless you have something to say, Zach, I think it's important to keep in mind, and we've said this before, so I don't want to sound like a broken record, but I think it's really important to hammer home that if we take kind of the evidence-based guidelines based on our best current meta-analyses and the best current research, if we're doing 10 to 20 sets per muscle group per week, right? If you were to do that much training volume and take it to a true failure, in which if you complete a repetition, you try the next rep and you go until you legitimately cannot move the concentric and you literally have to drop the barbell. Now, you might be able to do that on leg extensions like curls, but if you're doing compound movements and you're trying to accomplish these evidence-based guidelines, it's probably not going to be sustainable. I think a lot of the listeners will know that, but I think it's important to keep in mind how hard true failure is.
I was just going to say, not to cut that thought off, and this might take us on a tangent, but do you think that statement you just said right there, and the fact that the vast majority of the research to make those volume recommendations are all sets taken to quote unquote failure, do you think that should within itself change the recommendations?
Potentially, but I don't know if it would have a practical difference.
Right.
Because at the end of the day, in the absence of individual data accumulated, right, on that individual, you go with your best guess based on the research. So maybe what you're saying is, okay, instead of starting with 15 sets per week, we start with 18 sets per week and see how that goes. But so maybe.
Yeah, I guess.
Is that what you're getting at?
Yeah, to some degree. I think my kind of point is, so the volume recommendations primarily are in the context of sets, again, to quote unquote failure. And we know those are probably more like somewhere between 2 to 5 RAR.
Oh, I was taking it the other way.
Yeah, depending on the study. So if somebody was going to do that in practice, I think it's more realistic that they actually could complete that if the recommendations were actually reflective of somebody taking a set to true muscular failure. And so their recommendations would probably be more like 6 to 10 sets per week.
It could go either way.
Yeah, for sure.
Remember how we said, based on the research and again, not being in the lab, being able to see how these studies are actually conducted, it's still on the table that maybe true failure that the bros have been talking about for decades, there is something magical there.
Okay.
But also we leave on the table that people really only reach true failure in the lab. So thus we can actually train pretty dang far from failure.
Yeah.
On the same token, like you're saying, maybe the evidence-based guidelines are skewed up or down based on whichever direction they are skewed.
Yeah.
And this could also explain some of the differences between studies, right? Because we have these meta-analyses, and we kind of take it as fact, but when you actually look at the individual studies, there's some variation there, right? And that could explain it. Even if the methods, based on what's written, is equal, they both went to failure.
I was just going to say, this is, not to take this down a whole different rabbit hole, but that like the individual response thing, I wouldn't say I'm a skeptic, because the individual variability and individual response definitely exist. I'm just questioning the reason that does exist. And I think, like one study you reviewed recently was one of the DAMA studies that looked at the frequency thing. For example, and all of us having firsthand research experience, we know, like we said earlier, someone's RP8 isn't someone else's RP8. And if their protocol included the subject terminated the set when they no longer believed they could complete another repetition, if, let's say, and that was within subject design, correct?
Yep.
Let's say they do one leg and man, that session sucked. Mm-hmm. And so the next session they called failure earlier, just all those little limitations that can kind of infiltrate the entire landscape of the research, right? Because one of the variables that is so important, and again, we come back to this, and this is the reason we're proximity to failure nerds, is because in my opinion, it's literally the variable that matters the most, because everything else we manipulate is trying to get that to the target level. We manipulate load to get to a target proximity to failure for a given repetition range. We add repetitions to get to a given proximity to failure at a set load. That's the entire kind of landscape for training, in my opinion, for the most part. And so if proximity to failure isn't adequately controlled for, how do we know that the recommendations we have for everything else is really in a good spot? And I'm not trying to get super research nihilistic here, but it's just something to keep in mind when we have all these recommendations that we make. Volume, for example, sets per week. If you have a client that responds well to 6 sets per week, but you're freaking out because that's not within the 10 to 20 that they were given, but they come from a background in which they train really, really hard and their set quality is really high, I don't think that's unreasonable to assume that's actually within the correct kind of range if proximity to failure is slightly not the same in the gym as it is in the lab. So that was a really long tangent and kind of a off the wall comment. But
if you wanted answers to your training questions, you came to the wrong.
Can I go down a very slight bodybuilding tangent?
Yeah, go for it, man.
So that what you said there is really important with the set quality. That's a thing that's been kind of sweeping through bodybuilding lately too. People have been traditionally bodybuilders just go in and destroy themselves, right? And they do so much to failure and so much. They let their technique get a little funky. They'll push past failure, force reps, all this. So lately, it's been a lot more, as the literature has become more and more prevalent, people are focusing so much more on set quality, mm-hmm. and they can't believe their set numbers are cut in half and they're growing even more. So it's a very big thing. And
that's why the standardization we've discussed a little bit so far is so important. And this is why, a couple episodes ago we had Mike T on. This is why the bottom up some principles or ideas that reactive training systems has helped spread throughout the community are so important, because at the end of the day, you're probably your best bet is using that individual's data. And like Jake said, if you're straying from the evidence-based recommendations, but you're growing better than ever, why would you stop?
100%.
I don't even look at, I don't care if it's 10, 20 sets. I look at what they've been doing, right. What their results have been like, and how should we...
It's a starting point, and that's it. Yeah. It's a starting point in the absence of previous data on the individual.
Exactly.
Yep.
Right.
And then
which is essentially, for an online coach, essentially no one. Yeah, we do research, but we don't care apparently. So
I think that's everything I want to talk about.
Yeah, no, that was good. That was a good way to wrap it up.
I can wrap her up here.
Yeah, go ahead and wrap it up. Thanks for this is definitely not the second take of this podcast, and my dog definitely did not disrupt the first one the entire time. So shout out to my dog for being quiet and sitting in the corner like a good little pup. So
we'll wrap it up here. Let us know how this sounded for you guys. Me, Zach, and Jake are all hanging out in one room and recording this together as opposed to before. So this sounded great, awesome. If it sounded terrible,
sorry.
Do we want to? Do we want to know?
Hear this?
I was gonna say it's gonna be like this for a while.
It won't be posted if it's not trash.
If you're on YouTube, subscribe and hit the thumbs up button. If you're on a podcast app, leave a rating and review. What's up?
Let us know what you think of the new intro.
Oh yeah.
Shout out to,
are we gonna add that to this one?
Shout out to Chris for that.
Yeah, shout out to Jake's client Chris for putting together.
What's his band called again? Shout out his band.
Judd Who's.
Judd Who's. Yeah.
Good stuff.
Good stuff.
It's good stuff.
Yeah.
That's all we got. Appreciate you listening. Pretty cool you made it to the end of this. All these tangents and whatnot. So appreciate listening, and we'll see you in the next one.